Welcome back to class. We're going to cover an introduction to Africa today. It will cover some very basic information. It presumes you have no background information about Africa, although you may, but none is required. So we're going to start with the very basics. Um, the Lessons for the week then are also basic then, starting with the first one. Africa is a continent. All right. Then we're going to look at the size and location of the continent, and how that leads to certain issues of diversity across the continent. Following that, we'll take a look at ecological zones and their effects, rainfall patterns and their effects, the issue of change over time, and finally, sources for the past. All of this will be background information that will come up again and again and again, especially in the first half or so of the course. So it is vital information to make sure you understand now. And once again, if there's any questions, you know where to find me, even though for this presentation, I don't think you can see me, which is too bad because I'm wearing my Nigeria soccer jersey today. So, I'm looking pretty sportive. All right. So starting with some basics then, as I said. Africa is a continent. Okay, drives me nuts when people refer to Africa as a country, because Africa is a continent. It's actually the second largest continent in the world, comprising, depending on how one counts, 55 countries. All right, but still you see things like this. George W. Bush, Africa is a nation that suffers from incredible disease. Well, no, it's not a nation, because if it were a nation, it would be a country. It's a continent. All right, or our previous president, Trump, praising the healthcare of Nambia, a non-existent African country. What can I say? Okay, except for by the end of this class, you're going to know more about Africa than our previous president does. So there we go. So Africa is a continent. That's very important. But also important are the size and location of this continent. Relative size of the continent is very important, and there's a map like this in your textbook. It shows that you could take, the outline of China, the United States, and Western Europe, and fill Africa and still have a little bit of space left over. All right, so that should give you some idea of the size of the continent. Roughly 5,000 miles north to south, 4,500 miles east to west. So it's a big place. All right. As far as location, if you take a look at a world map, and I like this one because it puts Africa, boom, right there in the center. And I think that's also important because it shows relationships. And that's going to be very important for history. All right. Because for people in North Africa, they are bordering the Mediterranean Sea right across from Europe. So they're going to have historical relationships with people around the Mediterranean. People in East Africa, on the other hand, bordering the Indian Ocean, are going to have relationships with people around the Indian Ocean, and so on. So there's a saying that geography is the mother of history, okay? And I think that's certainly true in this case. Where people and groups are located, puts them in proximity to, of course, other peoples and other groups who they're going to have relationships with. Sometimes peaceful trading relationships, sometimes contentious military relationships, all of which we will see. So, but it's important for you to know, or at least have in your mind here, some idea of where Africa is located in the world. All right? Okay. If we were to focus just on the continent itself, then once again, you're going to see, and this shows what's known as the political map of Africa, the countries of today, and we'll get to this more in the latter part of the course. But once again, some 55 countries here, some of which are quite large. Algeria up in the north and Democratic Republic of Congo in the center are themselves almost as large as Western Europe. So these are large places. And distances can be quite great. Actually, distances in Africa are even probably greater than you might realize. It certainly has been the case historically, but it's even so today. I'm going to just give you a quick example here. A few years ago, I was traveling in Tanzania. I've been to a number of countries in Africa. I lived in Uganda, been to Tanzania a couple times, Kenya several times, and so on. Anyway, so I was taking a research trip in Tanzania here, and I was traveling with a colleague of mine, another history professor, from Dar es Salaam here down to Kilwa and then over to Lawali. All right? So Dar es Salaam, where the star is on the coast, down the coast to Kilwa, and then to the interior here to Lawali. A distance of which is about 300 miles. Matter of fact, almost exactly 300 miles. And if you go on Google Maps, it'll tell you that should take you about 7.5 hours to drive. Right? Seems pretty reasonable, right? Well, Google Maps is wrong. Okay? It took us 2 days. All right. Now, once again, to put that in perspective, 300 miles, that's the distance from Chicago to St. Louis. Okay. Which, if you're driving the speed limit, which who does, right? Okay. But if you're driving the speed limit, that's going to take you about 5 hours. Once again, same distance here, took us 2 days. Why is that? Well, in part because this is the road. It's especially once you go from Kilwa to Lawali, it's a one-lane, dirt, sandy road where you're going about, 20 miles an hour, maybe 25 sometimes, until you hit things like this bridge here. And this is the guy I was traveling with, Professor Sunseri, testing out whether or not we can drive over this bridge. We didn't, okay, and then we had to go around. So distances effectively across large parts of Africa are greater because travel is a lot more difficult. Right? So travel is more difficult, transporting goods and people is more difficult, it takes a lot more time. And that's even assuming you're in the dry season, as we were here. You see how dry it is, and this is a nice dirt road and so on. Well, I'll get to in just a minute here. Through parts of tropical Africa, you have a rainy season and a dry season. Dry season is the season of travel. Even in the dry season, this took 2 days. All right? So what do I mean by rainy season and dry season? Well, let's take a look at that here in just a minute. But if we look across Africa, we're going to see the diversity of the continent. Once again, this is a huge place, and it's not all the same. It's not all desert. It's not all grasslands. It's not all jungles. It's a variety of different types of terrains, or as I prefer to call, ecological zones. And once again, you have a map similar to this one on page 5 of your textbook here. Anyway, but it shows you different climate zones. If we start up in the north here, you see the huge expanse of the Sahara Desert. And as you move south from there, it gets wetter and wetter and wetter. So we have desert, then we have semi-desert, then we have kind of dry grasslands, then we have true grasslands, savanna woodland, and then rainforest in the middle of the continent. Okay? What determines these ecological zones largely is rainfall. Okay? Rainfall amounts. It's rainiest in the center of the continent, which is where the rainforest is. And then as you move out from that, it gets progressively drier and drier. Okay? Why? Because of the rainfall patterns back and forth across the continent. Okay? So it's two things, rainfall amounts, but also rainfall patterns. Now here's what I was talking about, rainy season, dry season. Your textbook talks about this, but I want to actually show it to you here. And this is a comparison of rainfall in Kano, Nigeria, on the left there, and Chicago, USA, on the right. Get roughly the same amount of rainfall every year, but the pattern is very different. In Chicago, that precipitation is spread out largely throughout the year. Okay, a little more rain, obviously, in the spring and early summer. We know that, right? Okay, and some in the fall, and then a little drier in the winter when it's more snow. Obviously, about an inch of rain is what is it supposed to be? About 10 inches of snow. So, that works out to be about right. But the pattern in Kano, Nigeria, is quite different. This is a classic African or tropical African rainy season, dry season pattern. And it's just what the name says. You have a rainy season here. And in this case, in Kano, it starts sometime in mostly May or really the latter part of June. And then you get all your rainfall for the year in about 3.5 months, and then it stops. That's it. And then you have the dry season. So you have a rainy season, which is also the agricultural season, and then you have a dry season. Total rainfall amount might be the same here, but that pattern has a big impact, and I'll show you why. Okay, so this is the country of Nigeria here in West Africa, the most populous country on the continent. Okay, we take a look at a map here. We see Kano in north central Nigeria. All right, and this is what Kano looks like. Does it look like Chicago? No, not really. Okay, it looks pretty desert-like. And one thing you see right there in the middle are palm trees, right? Okay, so yeah, that's not what you see in Chicago. What do you see in Chicago? Chicago looks like this. You get outside of the loop area, right? And it looks extremely green. This is a picture from the north side. This is actually from Evanston looking down into Chicago here. But I have another picture I took on an airplane going into Midway. So this is the southwest side as we're going into Midway Airport here. And it just looks very green, right? All these trees and grasslands and so on here. Right? Not because we get so much more rain, but it's the rainfall pattern that makes a difference. All right, so in Africa with a rainy season, dry season pattern, it's going to have a big impact, well, on everything, on how people live, where they can live, and how they get around too. You know, as I said, the dry season is a season for travel. This is a dry season road here in Gambia, a place I've been to a couple of times in West Africa. Hey, it's a dirt road, but it's not bad. You can go 30, 35 miles an hour on there, and it's pretty smooth, and you know, it's pretty good. This is the road in the rainy season. You can't go quickly on this. Okay, rainy season, once again, the season for agriculture, but it's also the time most people stay home because travel is so difficult. But you see the difference here. I mean, you see how dry it looks here, and dust covers everything. And then when the rains come, look how vibrant green that vegetation is on the side of the road. All the dust is washed away, and the plants get all this water, and they're growing, and it's vibrant. But it's also muddy and sloppy and really hard to get anywhere. Okay. So that's the other side of a rainy season, dry season pattern. It has a tremendous impact on how people live, and especially in how they can travel. Okay? All right. So we're talking about location here. The fact that we have well, I mentioned tropical rainy season, dry season pattern. Well, what do we mean by the tropics? Well, let's take a look at this map here. Africa is pretty much bisected, cut in half by the equator. As I hope you know, the equator is a somewhat imaginary line that runs around the center of the earth, right? Right? In this case, we have the equator running right through the center of the continent here. Matter of fact, it used to run right through where I used to live in Uganda. I used to live in Uganda right there at the tip of Lake Victoria. I could stand on my driveway and get on my tiptoes and see the lake from there. Okay, but if you look north and south of the equator, you see the lines of the tropics. To the north is what's called the Tropic of Cancer, and the south is the Tropic of Capricorn. Well, what does this mean? It means that Africa, as a continent, has a greater percentage of its area in the tropics than any other continent. And what does that mean? Well, that means a tropical environment. Tropical rainy season, dry season, tropical plants that we'll talk about next week, and so on. But also in this case, being in the tropics means tropical diseases. Okay? Because take a look at where that tropic line is in the north. Okay? Right about the southern border of the country of Egypt right here, right? And in the south, at the northern border of this country of South Africa. All right? But take a look at this map then. Whoops, that's not a map. That's a mosquito. That's an Anopheles mosquito, the main mosquito which spreads malaria. All right? A parasitic disease which affects millions of people across Africa. Where does it affect them? Mostly in the tropics. Here on the southern tip of the country of South Africa, and all the way up to not quite to Egypt, but through what is today Sudan and across West Africa here, but squarely in the tropics. Malaria is probably the classic tropical disease. Okay, and you see then the red area here is where you have the greatest prevalence, and that's through the greater part of the continent here. Okay, so being in the tropics means certain things. It means rainy seasons. But those rainy seasons also bring, well, as we'll see, certain plants, but also certain animals like the Anopheles mosquito. Okay? And as we know around here, when you get the rains, it brings mosquitoes, right? Okay? Yeah, well, we've started to get West Nile virus here, which actually, I don't know if you know, the West Nile virus actually comes from Uganda. There's a part of Uganda called the West Nile region, and that's where the disease originated. It was prevalent when I lived in Uganda in the early 90s, and then it made its way over here. But that's not my fault. I had nothing to do with that. But malaria is not the only tropical disease we see across the continent here. Human sleeping sickness, African sleeping sickness would be another disease, as you see here. It's also known as trypanosomiasis. That's a great word. It's a great word to go and impress your friends with. Your parents ask you what you learned about today, tell them trypanosomiasis. Okay, this is African sleeping sickness, which there's a human form, but there's also an animal form, and you'll read about that in your textbook, which is also very important because it strikes large animals. Why is that important? Well, you need large animals for certain tasks, historically, especially to pull plows, for transportation, and for milk and meat. And in these areas where you have the disease, you can't have large animals, and it robs people of a very important resource. Okay? So once again, in the tropics, in Africa, you have increased rainfall, which is good for agriculture, but it's not so good for other things. Okay, it brings disease, it brings mosquitoes, it brings the tsetse flies that spread sleeping sickness, and so on. All right, so the ecology of where people live is going to have a tremendous impact on how they live. That's going to be true whether they're farming, herding livestock, or just how they live with a disease environment. All right. Okay. Now, once again, the size of the continent is going to bring an incredible diversity across the continent. We saw that, going back here, we saw that already. Boom, boom, where is it? There we go, with ecological zones, right? Size of the continent means diversity of ecological zones. You've got desert, you've got grasslands, you've got rainforest, you've got mountain areas, all right? So not everybody is going to live in the same type of environment across the continent, okay? And in the same way, you're going to have a diversity of people, okay? And one of the ways to, and we'll talk some more about this, but one of the ways to categorize people across the continent is by language group. What languages do they speak, okay? There's probably, well, frankly, people don't know, but probably somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 languages spoken across the continent today. In the past, there were more, probably upwards of 2,000 different languages. Those languages are grouped into language families based on how closely related they are to each other. Okay? Let me give you an example from Europe. Okay? You have what are known as the Romance languages, languages that are derived from Latin. Okay? That means Italian, Spanish, Portuguese. Okay? All closely related languages. Right? They're in the same language family. That's similar situation we have here in Africa. This just shows the major language families. Okay? But if your language is in one of these language families, then it's easier to learn another language in that same family, right? Just as it is if you know Italian, it's easier to learn Spanish and vice versa. Okay? The first time I went to Italy, I didn't know any Italian. I spoke Spanish and I just spoke Spanish. And I think people thought it was just really bad Italian. Okay? There's a lot of words are the same and so on. Same thing with Portuguese and so on. But, I've studied actually three or four different African languages at this point, but the two main ones I studied are Swahili in East Africa and Luganda. And they're about 20-30% of the vocabulary is the same. So there's some mutual intelligibility there, right? And it's easier once you learn one, and I learned Swahili first, it's easier then to learn the second language, okay? But that's not the case for people who speak languages in different language families. So once again, when I lived in Uganda, people in the south part of Uganda spoke Bantu languages, these orange languages. People in the north spoke these Nilo-Saharan languages in the yellow color here, which means they couldn't really understand each other, okay? Those are about as different from each other as English is from Chinese, you know? I don't care how loud you speak to me in Chinese. I'm not going to understand it, okay? And people here can't understand it either. So diversity across the continent also can bring challenges with it and some problems, especially in contemporary times. So we look at, for example, of South Africa here. You've got, 11 different languages here in the country, 11 different major languages. There's more than that. None of them are spoken by more than 23% of the population as a first language. Matter of fact, Zulu is about 23% here, 24%, and then it drops down below 20% of the population speaks Xhosa. And then down less than 15% of the population speaks Afrikaans. So that diversity brings challenges. How are you going to have a united nation or country when you don't even speak the same language? Okay? So nation building, language policy, and so on are going to be a challenge in contemporary Africa, in part because of diversity. I know we always say diversity is our strength, and that's a big selling point at Northeastern, and I believe that it is. But as I said, it also brings challenges, right? Challenges in this case, literally understanding one another. Okay, now so we talked about the fact that Africa is a continent. We talked about the size of the continent. We talked about how that brings diversity in ecological zones. We talked about how in the tropics we have a rainy season, dry season pattern, how that also brings challenges with disease, right? And then we talked about, using language as an example, how you have a diversity of people across the continent. All right, those are some of our basic lessons for today. Two more things to talk about. One is this concept of historical change. Your textbook has a pretty good section in the front that talks about myths about Africa. And one of the major myths about Africa is that it's this unchanging place. That's not true. Now, I would argue that there is quite a bit of cultural continuity in Africa. But that doesn't mean that people there today are living as their ancestors did thousands of years ago. That's just not true. Okay? If it were true, we would have no history to study, because history is about change. If you don't have change, you don't really have history. Okay? The definition of history here is change over time. That's what history is. And that's what we're studying. Okay? That's why time is so important for us. People talk about historians being so wrapped up in dates. Well, it's not dates per se, but it is time periods. You need to figure out time periods so you can show this change and when it happened. So that's what we're going to be focusing on. Change over time. And we need to link those two together. And that's what we're going to do. Now, some of that change, especially recently, is going to come quickly. Okay? There'll be a lot of change. In the last 2 decades, everybody in Kenya is using mobile phones, right? Cell phones and cell phone apps and so on. But even looking at over larger time periods, as we're going to be doing in the first part of the course, you still see change. Okay? And let me give you an example of that. One example we have, and I'll give you here, is Lake Chad. Okay? Lake Chad, as you can see on this map here, is a lake in West Africa, bordering Chad, Niger, Nigeria, and Cameroon. Really in the four corners of where these four countries come together. All right? Well, I should say Lake Chad is there. Actually, it's closer to the truth to say Lake Chad was there, because this is what's happened to Lake Chad over the last few decades. Well, the last 6 decades anyway. Okay, we go back to 1963, Lake Chad looked pretty vibrant. Okay, it was a healthy lake, but it's been disappearing over the last 5 decades or so. You go by 1973, the area of the lake had reduced considerably. By 1987, it looks like it's almost gone. 97 bounces back a little bit. 2001, it's a shadow of itself. Okay? And if we look to today, and I mean today, because just this morning I went on Google Earth, pulled up an image of what Lake Chad looks like today, and this is what it looks like. There's almost no water at all. That's all vegetation. The lake is virtually gone. Now, whatever you think about global warming, the fact is climate change is real, and especially real in West Africa, where things are drying out. And we can see it right here. We have visual evidence of that, right? That's not what a healthy lake should look like, right? I also went on Google Earth and looked at Lake Michigan. That's what Lake Michigan looks like, okay? That's what a healthy lake should look like. Lake Chad, not so much. It's virtually not even a lake anymore, all right? Now, and that's not the only change we can see in geography, okay? If we go back even further, we can see other changes happening. Let me actually show you this map first. We go back to 9000 BC, and what do we see? What is today the Sahara Desert was, at least half of it, Mediterranean grasslands. Okay? There were people living in that area that were hunting elephants and hippos and fishing and living in swamps. How do we know that? Well, I'll tell you that in just a minute. Okay? But we do know that. Okay? But then you fast forward to about 2000 BC and you see the beginnings of the Sahara Desert as we know it today. Although it will keep drying out because that desert is much larger today. It stretches all the way down over here, okay? Down past the bend of the Niger River and the Senegal River, okay? So we've had a progressive drying out of the environment. Not all in a straight line. It's been up and down a little bit, but over the larger scope of time, we have seen this environment drying out more and more and more, and even more in recent times, in the last 5 or 6 decades or so. So that is having a tremendous impact on how people across West Africa or across the continent can live. Okay? So we definitely see change over time in big picture things like the environment and in smaller ways too, like how people live. And that's what we're going to be dealing with in this class. Historical change over certain time periods. All right? And how are we going to do that? Well, the main way we're going to do that, sources. Okay? When we talk about history, we have to have sources. We have to have a source of information. Okay? I can't just stand up here and make stuff up. I could, but okay, I'm not going to. All right? Everything I say is based on some type of sources. Now, the field of history, especially as it developed in Europe as an academic field from the 19th century onward, was based around written sources. That's really what it deals with. That's not going to help us much in African history, especially at the beginning part of the class. Why? Well, most of the societies we're going to study were not literate. They didn't have written sources. They didn't have their own languages. Okay? There are a couple of exceptions that we'll see. Ancient Egypt, they had several writing systems actually, and Ethiopia. They had their own writing system, their own written language. Okay? But those two are the exceptions. So in most cases, for the first few weeks of the class, when we're dealing with written sources, we're dealing with sources written by outsiders. Okay? And as we'll go through, those can have pluses and minuses. All right? But we'll definitely deal with written sources where we can find them. But the thing about African history, and I think the thing that makes it really special as a practice, the way we pursue African history, is we rely on a lot of different types of sources. My colleagues in U.S. history don't so much. They have a lot of written sources, so they focus on those. We don't have, so we have to look at other things. Okay? So we look at written sources where we can, but then we also look at oral sources. That can be like oral epics, like stories about how a society was founded, or it can be other types of oral things such as songs or poetry or proverbs or anything, okay, that gets passed on in a society. We'll also use archaeology and material remains, okay, what gets left behind from a society. That can be very important in telling us how people lived. We'll also take a look at linguistics, languages that people speak. And we'll go into this in more detail, but basically, if a language has a word for an object, then we know they had that object, okay? And that tells us some clues about how they lived, whether that object is an actual item, like a bow and arrow or an axe, or it's something social like a nephew or a mother-in-law, okay? You know, if you have something in your society, in your consciousness, typically we have a word for it. And by studying those words, it gives us insights into how people live and how they thought. Okay? Then we'll look at other things too, climate-wise, and this is where I said we'll look at how we know about the Sahara Desert wasn't always a desert. Okay, we look at pollen, which is what plants leave behind, and tree rings and things like that. Those tell us what kind of plants lived there. Okay. And also early on, we're going to look at some rock paintings. And that's how we know people in what became the Sahara Desert were living in a different type of environment and what they were hunting, because they left behind paintings. Okay? They didn't leave written accounts so much, but they left drawings on the sides of cliffs and so on that tell us what they were doing, what kind of animals they were hunting and so on. So, we have to be in African history a little more creative in our use of sources and what we're going to look at than, as I say, some of my colleagues in other fields are. It makes it challenging, but I think it also makes it a lot more exciting. And that's what we're going to get to. All right, so that's our introduction to the continent, to diversity across the continent, impact of certain things, change over time, and historical sources that we're going to use in this class. Thanks very much.